Have you ever said, I just don't have the energy to do it? Or, I have zero energy today. Well, the only time you're ever going to have zero energy is when you're dead. Because everything your body does requires energy. All living organisms require energy. Think about muscle contraction. Now, it's pretty easy to understand that it's going to take energy for you to contract your muscles and walk around or go for a run or lift weights. But your heart's made of muscle, and it has to contract to push blood through your body. Your digestive system has muscle that has to contract to move your food products from your mouth to the waste products that come out your anus. You've got to have energy to contract the muscles associated with breathing. So you're never completely without energy. All metabolic processes take energy. But just like your car needs gasoline to do the work that it does, your body needs fuel as well. And in the human body, that fuel is ATP. In its most simple definition, energy is simply the capacity to do work. There are two major classes of energy, potential and kinetic. Potential energy, think of it this way, it has the potential to do work because of its position. So it's stored energy. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. So kinetic energy can be converted or changed to kinetic and vice versa. So kinetic can be changed to potential. Potential can be changed to kinetic. Sorry, guys. So, for example, if you think about if you've ever seen a dam, there's water on both sides of it, and typically the water is high on one side and low on the other. Well, the water on the high side of the dam, we say it's behind the dam. It has potential energy because of its position. It's high and it's behind the barrier. But when the water falls over the dam, it now has kinetic energy because of its motion. And that kinetic energy of the fallen water can be used to drive a turbine or a water wheel at the bottom of the dam. That's causing an action or motion. Another example of potential energy is a bow and arrow. So that's converting one form of energy to another if you think about what's going to happen. So first of all, when you pull that arrow back in the bow, it has potential energy because of the tension on the bowstring. When you release it, that potential energy is converted, the arrow flies. Now we have kinetic energy in the flying arrow because it can do work. It can kill the deer or knock the apple off the tree. Human cells have potential energy as well because of a concentration gradient. Now, a concentration gradient simply means there's a difference in something across two areas. So we're talking about a concentration gradient across the plasma or cell membrane. Now remember, that's a barrier between the inside and the outside of the cell. So typically we have more sodium ions outside the cell and fewer sodium ions right inside the cell. So we have a concentration difference across the cell membrane. Well, that's the same thing as water at the top of the dam, because the water at the top of the dam represented potential energy. Well, the sodium has potential energy as well, because when we move sodium from where there's a high concentration to where there's a low concentration, then that can cause something to happen in a cell. That's actually what causes your muscles to contract, and boy, you're going to get a bunch more of that later on. Potential energy is also exhibited by the position of electrons in an electron shell as relative to the atom's nucleus. Now remember, the nucleus was in the middle, the shells are the orbits around it. So when shells move, when the electrons move during chemical reactions, then that is movement, so that is kinetic energy, the energy of movement. Now, we're going to go pretty deep into that as we continue in this chapter, but potential energy, remember, has the potential to do work, and kinetic energy is energy of doing work. causing motion to occur, or whatever the action may be. As we look at your concept overview in your textbook, it's on page 74 and 75 if you want to have the big fold out image of this. We're seeing several things here. In the first box at the top, A, you can see the difference in potential and kinetic energy referring to the sodium gradient across the cell membrane. So when you have more sodium outside of the cell, we call that in the extracellular fluid, than you do inside the cell in the intracellular fluid, then that sodium has potential energy. When that sodium is able to cross the cell membrane, as you see here, then that movement of sodium ions can be used to depolarize that muscle cell, and if it's a muscle, it's going to contract. The energy of movement. So from potential to kinetic. Now we're going to cover this C part, laws of energy, in just a moment. So let's go ahead and jump down here to this box at the bottom. Usable forms, or forms of usable energy that are available in the body for us to use to do work. So we've already talked about potential energy. So chemical energy is energy stored in the chemical bonds of molecules, like we saw when we had that big glycogen molecule in the previous chapter. So all of these glucose molecules are hooked together, remember? And we can break those chemical bonds, and as we do so, then we can use that glucose to make ATP, okay? Now, kinetic energy, as you see on the second part of this, there are several different forms of this. So electrical energy is simply the movement of charged particles. So moving ions from one place to another. Now, this is going to depolarize muscle cells. That's the example that we saw previously. But that, again, is just movement of ions, electrical energy. Mechanical energy moves something. So remember, mechanical energy causing movement. For instance, when the heart muscle contracts, it moves blood out of the heart. Sound energy is in the form of sound waves that have to move through a medium, and the sound waves are initiated by something vibrating. Radiant energy is the movement of electromagnetic waves that travel through the universe. They vary in their wavelength and their frequency. For instance, the light rays that hit your retina, which that's your nerve receptors in your eye, that depolarizes those cells and sends information to the brain. And when that information gets to the brain, you know what you're seeing. Well, you know what you're seeing after your brain processes that information, at least. Chemical energy, as you've seen, it's just a form of potential energy. It's the energy that's stored in a molecule's chemical bonds, and it's the most important form of energy for the human body. It's used for the energy requiring processes of moving your body or moving things within your body, for synthesizing or making molecules, for maintaining and establishing those concentration gradients. The chemical bonds of all molecules have chemical energy. The energy is released when those bonds are broken. Now, there are three important molecules in the human body that function primarily in the chemical energy storage. So their job, store chemical energy so that we can use it. So triglycerides are involved in long-term energy storage because we store it in our fat cells, in adipose tissue. Glucose is stored, as we've already seen, in the liver and the muscle tissue in the form of glycogen. We can break it down when we need energy. But ATP, man, that is the stuff. So ATP is stored in all cells in limited amounts, but it's produced continuously and used immediately for all the things that your cells do that require energy. ATP is human gasoline. So as you see, energy can be converted from one form to another. Your book gives a couple of good examples. I'm going to just give you those right quick. So when a candle's burning, the chemical energy from the burning wax is converted to light and heat. Different forms of energy, right? When light energy from the sun is converted by the cells in your eye into electrical energy that makes a nerve impulse. That's converting, and then it's involved in us being able to see. Chemical energy in the food we eat is first going to be converted to ATP. Then we break down that ATP to power muscle contraction. So the study of this conversion of types of energy is called thermodynamics. We have two laws of thermodynamics, and the first law says that energy can't be created or destroyed. It's only converted from one form to another. The second law of thermodynamics states that every time energy is transformed from one form to another, it loses heat. So some of that energy is converted to heat. That simply means that there's never a 100% conversion of energy from one form to another. That also explains why the hood of your car gets hot when your car is breaking chemical bonds to power that engine. There are millions of chemical reactions happening in your body all the time. Millions. We're busy folks, huh? So metabolism, remember, is simply the term that expresses all the chemical reactions in living organisms. So a chemical reaction occurs when chemical bonds in an existing molecule is broken down or new ones are formed. We express that action as a chemical equation, with the reactants being the things that are present before the reaction, and we write those on the left side of the equation, and then the chemical reaction occurs and produces products, which that's what you make with the chemical reaction. It's written on the right side of the equation. So if you look at the very first one up there in the example of the combination reaction, we have A plus B, then the reaction occurs, A plus B makes C, which would be the product. Now, if you look at just the way they've got it written up here, we start with a separate A and a separate B. We have the chemical reaction and we end up with AB. Okay, so AB would represent the C right here. Now, think about what we saw with sodium chloride. We started over here with sodium and chloride. The chemical reaction occurred, and boom, we made sodium chloride. All right, now we're not going to get too deep in all that because, guys, if you're going to do chemistry, you're going to take chemistry classes. But you do need to understand what chemical reactions are. Now, if it is a balanced equation, the number of elements are equal on both sides of the reaction. So I can't stress this enough. Remember, metabolism is simply all the biochemical reactions taking place in the body. We classify them in one of three ways. Catabolic reactions are decomposition. Remember, catabolic, take big things, break it into small things. Anabolic reactions are synthesis reactions. Anabolic means to build. To synthesize means to make. And the third category is exchange reactions, where we have atoms, molecules, ions, or electrons, whatever, that are exchanged between two chemical structures. So it has both decomposition and synthesis as this type of reaction, which is the most common type of reaction in the human body. An example of a catabolic or decomposition reaction, we start out with this molecule of sucrose, which is a 1,2 disaccharide. And what do? We add water and the bond breaks. So that is a hydrolysis reaction. That is a decomposition. Remember, hydrolysis, decomposition. We use water to break bonds that decompose or break down large molecules. So we start with a disaccharide, add water, break the chemical bonds through hydrolysis, and we end up with two individual monosaccharides. Bet you know what's coming next, huh? Of course you do. Anabolic reactions are synthesis. We build. Okay, so we have two amino acids. We remove water, dehydrate reaction, and what happens? Now these two amino acids will form a peptide bond together, And instead of two separate amino acids, we have a dipeptide. And here's number 3, our exchange reaction. So here we have a molecule of creatine phosphate and an ADP. Now remember, our gasoline is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Okay, so if we take a creatine phosphate and an adenosine diphosphate and cause a chemical reaction to occur, and we'll talk more about that later, then that creatine loses its phosphate and it hooks on to the ADP, and now we have adenosine, 1, 2, 3, adenosine triphosphate. Oxidation reduction reactions, we commonly just call them redox. Too many syllables to put it all together, right? So these are reactions where it's a type of an exchange reaction. So it involves the movement of electrons from one chemical structure to another. So oxidation is when a molecule, atom, ion loses electrons and becomes oxidized. Reduction occurs when a molecule, atom, or ion gains electrons and becomes reduced. So the term reduced is used because the chemical structure gains an electron. Now remember, electrons are negative, so you can think of it as it's reduced in charge. Okay? So I use this silly little mnemonic right here. Oxidation is loss. Loss of what? Electrons. Reduction is gain. Reduction is gain. Gain of what? Gain of electrons. I learned that years and years ago, and I think of it every time because it always helps me remember. Now, a lot of times, electrons are going to move by themselves or with a hydrogen ion as well. One example that we're going to examine near the end of this chapter is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Wow. Let's just go with NAD. Okay? Now notice that little plus sign right there. Do you remember what that tells you? It has a positive charge. How did it get a positive charge? It lost an electron. Oxidation is lost. Now, before I go into this slide, I want to remind you of something. You see all this up here? This is an image that explains what's going on. But guys, I'm not going to ask you to draw this type of stuff out. I want you to understand these concepts, okay? The pictures go into a good bit of detail very frequently. And all we're looking at is the oxidized form of NAD and the reduced form of NAD. Oxidation reduction. So let's look at that just briefly. So in this image, we're looking at an energy-rich molecule like glucose, and it's being oxidized. We know that because it's given up 2 hydrogen ions, while NAD has gained both a hydrogen ion and 2 electrons. So NAD is being reduced. Now, one of those hydrogen ions is just released into the local environment where all this reaction is occurring. So the movement of electrons can be harnessed to do work. So the electrons in a redox reaction represent energy transfer. So when we say glucose is oxidized, we're indicating that the glucose is losing electrons and releasing chemical energy. Other molecules are reduced and gain both electrons and energy. So NAD plus becomes NADH as it gains 2 electrons. And energy from that movement of electrons can be used to do work, such as the way we do when we make ATP. Chemical reactions can also be classified by the amount of chemical energy that's associated with the reactants and the products. We have 2 major categories, and it's based on energy change, and they're termed endergonic and exergonic. So remember early in our lectures, I said that words tell you something. Exo means outside, endo means within, And ergon means work. So outside work, inside work. Now, exergonic reactions react with more potential energy in their chemical bonds than the chemical bonds in their products. So we're producing energy. So think energy goes out or is released during the breakdown. Endergonic reactions, the reactants have less energy in their chemical bonds than what the products are, so energy is used. So think we have to put energy in for those reactions. So your catabolic reactions are decomposition. Okay, remember we're breaking down. Endergonic reactions are making. Those are your anabolic reactions. ATP cycling refers to the continuous formation and breakdown of ATP. Now I'm going to repeat this a few more times and then I'm going to stop. Remember, ATP is our fuel, okay? ATP in the human body is like gasoline in your car. So the energy required for us to make ATP is supplied by breaking down of glucose and other fuel molecules in the foods we eat. Those molecules undergo oxidation. Energy is stored within their chemical bonds and is transferred to ADP with a phosphate to form ATP. Now, the other side of that, ATP splitting, releases that stored energy, which is used for energy-requiring processes in our cells. So ATP cycling involves ATP as sort of the intermediary or the molecule that gets changed around. So it's a fuel molecule that releases energy, and then our cellular processes require that energy. Now, the one thing about ATP, we're constantly making ATP because we can't stockpile it. So cells typically only have a few seconds worth of fuel, ATP. So ATP has to constantly be made. Reaction rate simply determines how quickly chemical reactions take place. Now remember, it takes energy to break chemical bonds. And how much energy it takes to break those bonds determines the reaction rate. So in order to overcome the activation energy in lab, we can just increase temperatures, put something over a flame. That provides the energy to break bonds. Well, that's all well and good in lab. We can't do that in the human body. So those significant temperature increases in living cells would denature our proteins, just like the stove denatures the egg protein. So instead we use something called enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that work as catalysts to lower the energy needed for activation. So if you look here at the graph, you've got how much energy on the y-axis and the reaction happening, progressing on the x-axis. Now the substrate is simply what an enzyme works on. So let's say glucose, okay? The product is what you create. Now, the enzymes are specific. They work on a particular substrate. So without the enzymes in our body to break down glucose, it would take a ton of energy to activate and cause this chemical reaction to occur. Okay? Now, if you look at the purple line, with enzymes present, here's our substrate. So the enzyme that breaks down this substrate, glucose, as we said, allows this reaction to occur with much less energy. So that is going to take less time for that reaction to occur. So again, enzymes are chemical catalysts. They're proteins. They cause reactions to happen more effectively, quicker, by lowering the activation energy. All right, so enzymes here in blue, okay, so this is a globular protein. Your substrate is here in orange. Now remember, your enzyme is that biological catalyst that speeds up chemical reactions by reducing the amount of energy needed to cause that reaction to occur. Enzymes bind with a specific substrate, sort of like your keys. So let's say you have a house key, a car key, an office key, and a key to your motorcycle. Okay? So 4 different keys. But since they're all yours, you can just take any one of those keys and start your car, right? And your motorcycle key will open your house door. No, we know it doesn't work that way. Well, enzymes are very similar. A particular enzyme will only fit a particular substrate. And when it does, it forms an enzyme substrate complex. So it temporarily forms that little complex, the reaction takes place, and the enzyme lets go and is ready to do another job of the same exact thing, because remember, it only fits one substrate. So in a synthesis reaction, here we've got blue, our enzyme, and glucose up here, that's our substrate. So the glucose substrate binds to the enzyme and forms the complex. Now sometimes the enzyme will change a little bit of its shape to make everything fit better, and another glucose molecule binds, and we form a chemical bond between those, and that continues to happen, and we form that long chain molecule called glycogen, which is now released. A decomposition reaction, remember synthesis is to build, decomposition is to break. So here we've got our enzyme, it's called lactase. ACE at the end of the name tells you it is an enzyme. Now, not all enzymes end in ASE, but very, very many of them do. So if you see ASE, that should tell you enzyme. The first part of the word tells you what the substrate is, what the enzyme acts on. So ACE tells us enzyme, lact tells us it breaks down lactose. Okay, so lactose is a disaccharide. So the disaccharide, lactose, binds to the enzyme, lactase. The enzyme changes, the bond is broken. The products now are 2 monosaccharides, and the enzyme is now free to go break down another lactose. Some enzymes require helpers in order to do their job. These helpers can be cofactors or coenzymes. They can be inorganic or organic. So the inorganic cofactors actually attach to the enzyme, and they're required for the enzyme to be able to do its job. For example, zinc has to bind to carbonic anhydrase, which is an enzyme, because without the zinc, the enzyme can't function. Organic cofactors are sometimes called coenzymes. They do not attach to the enzyme or the substrate. Now, many vitamins, especially B vitamins or derivatives of vitamins, or even modified nucleotides like NAD that we talked about, and also FAD, they serve as organic cofactors. Metabolic pathways have to be regulated so that we don't overproduce something that we don't need or run out of the substrate that we could use somewhere else. So the regulation process occurs through a process of negative feedback, where the product of the metabolic pathway acts as an inhibitor to turn off an enzyme early in the metabolic pathway. One specific way that we regulate enzymes is either phosphorylation or dephosphorylation of that particular enzyme. So phosphorylate means to add a phosphate group, and that is done by phosphorylases, ACE, enzyme, or kinases. So they turn off some enzymes but turn on others. D, remember, says remove. So dephosphorylation is done only by phosphatases, and they turn off some enzymes, turn on others. Some prescription drugs and even over-the-counter drugs can increase or decrease the activity of an enzyme. For example, penicillin slows down bacterial enzymes. That slows the spread of that infection by interfering with the bacterial cells from being able to make new cell walls, therefore they can't make new bacterial cells. Another example is Viagra. It inhibits an enzyme, phosphodiesterase, and allows for vasodilation of the blood vessels in the penis, leading to a penile erection. Something that you can get over the counter, NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They interfere with an enzyme that's part of the inflammatory pathway. And by interfering with that enzyme, it helps to slow down and to potentially stop the inflammation. Hence the name, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory.